Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started because I have a feeling that there are going to maybe a lot of questions, and we want to make sure that we leave time for questions after this presentation. Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Holtzman. I am the President and CEO of the Miami-Dade County affiliate of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, otherwise known as NAMI. We provide support, education, and advocacy for people living with mental health conditions and their loved ones. We cover Miami-Dade County as well as Monroe County, so Miami-Dade and the Keys. And joining me on the call from our team, from the NAMI team, is Eileen Pestana. She's doing our tech work, so we're very dependent. Eileen does a lot of our outreach work. Many of you may have met her. She's a great asset to our team. And I just want to note that the presentation is going to be given in English. However, both Stephanie and Eileen speak Spanish, so if you prefer to ask questions in Spanish, you can type them into the chat after the presentation, and Stephanie will be able to answer them in English or Spanish. So if you have a preference for Spanish, please let us know. So we're very excited about this evening's presentation called Voices Unheard, Second Generation Immigrant Mental Health. It's obviously an extremely timely topic, always timely really here in Miami, but even more so now. And I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Stephanie McGrone. Stephanie is a licensed mental health counselor with years of experience working with individuals of varying ages and backgrounds. She earned her master's in mental health counseling from Nova Southeastern University in Miami and has helped her clients manage their mental health challenges and issues in their relationships with compassion and care. She provides a space for clients to feel comfortable expressing their thoughts and discuss together ways to overcome their struggles. In her experience, Stephanie has found that a collaborative approach with her clients and using various techniques from theories such as cognitive behavioral and client-centered have been most effective in helping clients. She looks forward to continuing to make a difference in the lives of her clients by helping them grow and achieve the goals set for themselves. Her areas of expertise include adjustment disorder, anxiety disorders, conflict resolution therapy, depression, eating disorders, life transitions and stressors, marriage and family counseling, maternal mental health, parenting counseling, personality disorders, teen anxiety disorder, and teen eating disorders. So that's quite an array of areas. And we are so excited to welcome you here. Stephanie, if you want to go ahead and get started.
Yes, thank you so much, Susan and Eileen, for helping me out and for allowing me the honor and the privilege to present today on a topic that is very near and dear to me as a second generation immigrant. I think it's incredibly important. As you said, it is timely because of how things are happening in the world right now that we talk about this. And so, again, thank you. I'm very excited to be here. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so I think that most of us have a general knowledge of immigration is, but I will say that I will be reviewing a lot of information that, like I said, probably most of us know, but just to get us into the mindset of understanding a little bit of what's happening. And so let's just define immigration quickly. We understand that immigration is the action of coming to live permanently in a foreign country. I think that some of us have more experience with immigrations than others. Like you said, living in Miami and having seen on the news a lot of stories about people migrating through various means. And in Miami, we have an understanding of migration as being primarily Hispanic, but let's not forget that we also have to take into account a lot of other key minority groups, such as not only the Latino community, but also members of the Asian communities and Asian cultures, Pacific Islanders, the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color populations. So it's important to just take all of those different cultures into account when we talk about immigration and not just generalize it into perhaps our one perceived understanding of what immigration is. So I know that the title of the presentation is focusing on second generation immigrant mental health, but I also think strongly that it's important for us to understand some of the first generation immigrant mental health and to understand the connection between the two. how the mental health of the parents and the struggles that they have been through creates an environment that starts affecting the mental health of their children. So for the purpose of this presentation, to define, a first-generation immigrant is the individual and perhaps the family that makes the decision to move from their country of origin to their destination, the country that they picked to move into. And a second-generation immigrant are the children of those immigrants, those that are born in the new country, in the country that they have since been established in. And we also have what are called 1.5 generation immigrants, which are the children that were brought over to the new country at a young enough age where they're still experiencing those changes, those struggles with the biculturalism. So in understanding why families and individuals migrate, we can further understand how that transgenerational trauma is created. We can expand on how first-generation immigrant experience affect the family dynamics and their parenting approaches, which then helps us understand the second-generation mental health. Okay, so as I said before, I think it's important for us to talk about first-generation immigrant health. And so first, we're going to talk about why some people migrate. I have on the screen 4 factors that that can occur in an individual's home country that can lead them to start developing certain struggles with their mental health that will then push them to make the decision to leave their country of origin and move into their country that they have chosen to move into. So all of these have an effect on each other in some way. So I'm not going to list them in any particular order, but understand that one probably affects the other. So to start, we can talk some about the economic struggles that individuals may face in their country of origin. Like I said before, there could be a lot of things happening in this country that have created this sort of like perfect storm and a perfect environment that allow the individuals in these countries to struggle with their economic status. For example, perhaps they don't have access to certain employment opportunities. Perhaps they don't have access to food, resources, perhaps homelessness. And when we get into the political aspect, we might get a better understanding as to why this happens. But for now, let's just understand that when these individuals make the decision to leave their country of origin, they are not doing it oftentimes because they want to. It's more of a circumstantial situation that is making them feel like they don't have any opportunities in their country of origin. The second factor that we have listed here is the social aspect. And I think that one of the most important parts of the social aspect that can lead an individual to make the decision to leave their country of origin can be discrimination and feeling radicalized in the country that they are living in. Even if it's the country that they were born in, perhaps the choices that they have made throughout their life or the way they were raised has led the citizens of that country to make them feel pushed out or that they don't belong there, even within their own country. We also understand that perhaps they don't have access to certain educational opportunities, like attending college, and then leading into not having good employment opportunities, as well as struggling with family reunification. So again, we'll get into the political in a second, but there could be various reasons as to why these individuals' family might have already left the country and have left these individuals feeling like they don't have a place and that they're alone. And so they're looking to leave this country to reunite with the family that has already left. So one of the reasons why these things could be happening in their country of origin is because of political reasons. So we're looking at things like war and conflict that are creating an environment in which these individuals don't feel safe within their own country. I'm talking about places like Cuba and Venezuela, in which you hear a lot of turmoil because of the political climate in which a certain regime has taken over and has created this situation in which individuals don't feel safe and don't have the means to be successful, don't have the means to be able to push forward and create a life in which they know their children are going to be successful. They have a fear for their own life, they have a fear of violence, and they have a fear of forced displacement. When we talk about forced displacement, we go back to that discrimination. Perhaps these individuals are following a religion that the government does not agree with, and they make the decision that, you know, these people don't belong with us, and so they are forcibly displaced. And lastly, we talk about the environmental factors. So this could be something like a volcano, a tornado, a hurricane, anything that creates a physically unsafe environment for these individuals to live in, leaving them perhaps homeless or without access to their work, whether if they work in the fields and their crops are destroyed, or whether they work in an office building and the office building has been knocked down. And so these are just some factors that might lead a group of people or an individual to make the decision to leave their country of origin and try to find a better outcome elsewhere. So let's assume that these individuals have made the decision to leave their country, and they said, okay, we are going to seek passage somewhere else in another country where we have the hope that things are going to be more successful for us. Unfortunately, the reality of the matter is, if these individuals have already been struggling from before with their economic status and with the capacity to be able to feed themselves or house themselves, the reality of the matter is that they're probably not going to have the means to be able to secure a safe passageway to the country that they have chosen as their destination. And so this leads to a lot of immigrants that are trying to migrate to another country to experience dangerous journeys in that attempt to move. So here in Miami, as I said before, we hear that a lot with Cuban immigrants who leave Cuba, and you know, they leave under precarious conditions because they get on a raft with a group of people in the hopes that they'll be able to traverse 90 miles of open water and be able to arrive to America and set foot on land, and then they have the resources available to them here. You also hear about this in Mexico, people trying to cross the border and unfortunately being in a dangerous situation where they don't have access to food, they don't have access to water, they're not sleeping in a 5-star hotel. They're just trying to get to their destination. And, excuse me, unfortunately, this allows them to be exploited if, for example, by smugglers, if there is a smuggler that promises them safe passage for whatever money they have on them, they could very easily be taken advantage of in that way, where they take their money. But unfortunately, also it can create opportunities for there to be physical and sexual trauma, where they find themselves in an unsafe environment, making the journey to the new country that they have chosen to move into, whether that is through the group that they are with, or even from the smugglers or the people that are trying to get them access to this country, which leads a lot of people to feel unsafe in the journey. And in fact, the journey can be so dangerous that it can lead to death and other trauma, for example, separation of their loved ones. If their loved ones are on this journey and, you know, they have a fear of being caught by the government that's chasing them, they get separated, and then you don't know when you're going to be able to meet up with your family member again, if ever. Sometimes the journeys are so dangerous that it can lead to some individuals unfortunately passing away on in their attempt to be free from the country that they just left. So now let's assume that they have successfully made the journey into their country of choice and they are trying to get established. So here we're going to start talking a little bit about some of the post-migration struggles. So these are some of the struggles that these individuals are going to be facing once they have arrived at the country that they have chosen to move into. One of the struggles that they can face is acculturative stress. And we're going to get into this a little bit more when we talk about the second generation immigrants. But acculturative stress essentially is that struggle where you have a certain values aligned where you came from, the way that you have been raised, and the way that you do things. and the country that you arrive perhaps does not align with those same values. And so you find yourself struggling with the way that you do things and why do people do things a certain way. You're just essentially having difficulty adapting to new culture, new language, and new social norms. We also have to understand that many of these individuals do not have social support at the country that they have arrived to. In some cases, they do, which is great because they have someone who is receiving them, who is able to provide housing for them, and is able to provide resources for them. But unfortunately, there are situations in which these individuals do not have that support. And so they're leaving one country and going into this new one with the knowledge that they're not going to have much waiting for them at this country that they arrive in. Many of these individuals also make the choice to leave their children behind in their country of origin because they hope to be able to establish themselves fully before bringing their children along, which also leads to more trauma and heartbreak on their part. We also have individuals whose family members that they left behind don't agree with their choice to move into a new country, which means that they've left family behind that perhaps no longer speak to them and also are arrived in this new country and they don't have the support that they're looking for. These individuals can also experience discrimination, racism, prejudice, and hostility based on their ethnicity and their immigration status. And it creates an environment in which they don't feel welcome. Trauma is incredibly important at this point as well, because we have to understand everything that these individuals just went through, which essentially puts them in what we call survival mode, where they're not focusing on the mental health or the emotional part of things. Right now, they're just focusing on ensuring that we have somewhere to live, we have somewhere to get food, we're trying to find a job, and that can create, which we'll get into, a struggle with their emotional capacity. As I said before, with a culture of distress, we can also experience language barriers, situations in which these individuals do not feel comfortable because they don't understand what's happening, because they're not able to find jobs, because they don't speak the language that is spoken in their country that they have arrived to. These individuals probably don't have access to services like healthcare or employment. They probably experience financial struggles. They probably experience poor living conditions. And in some cases, we also have, for undocumented immigrants, the fear of deportation, which can lead to significant stress, anxiety, and depression. So let's just take a moment to acknowledge that these individuals, not only are they facing these struggles in the moment, but they've probably been experiencing these struggles with anxiety, depression from when they were still living in their country of origin, because they were experiencing significant trauma during that time. Okay, so at this time, these individuals have arrived at their chosen country and they have gone through this incredible traumatic experience, which has placed them in survival mode, which means that they're, like I said, they're not focusing on their mental health. They're just focusing on trying to find a place to live, find a place to eat. However, that doesn't take away from the mental health conditions that they could be experiencing based on the traumatic experiences that they've had. So this could be something like anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, or suicidal ideation. The anxiety can come from a place of not knowing, of the fear of the unknown. It's a fear that perhaps the outcomes of the choices that they have made is not leading them to the place and the situation that they want to arrive in. If this goes unchecked long enough, of course, it can develop into something like a depression, where they start to develop that feeling of hopelessness, of not being sure if this was the right decision, and trying to find a way out of this in whatever way they can. Not only do they have to deal with the stressors of being in this new country and all of the hardships that they overcame to get here, because they are in survival mode, they have not been processing the trauma that they've been experiencing, which leads them to develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'll give you a hint and let you know that most of these individuals do not cope with these traumatic events in a healthy way, instead choosing to bury it down and ignore it as best as they can, justifying it through their need to move on and forward to a better future. However, this leads to emotional suppression and the intergenerational impact and how this affects their relationship with their children, which is now we're going to be getting into that second generation mental health. Okay. Many first generation immigrants have experienced significant trauma. As we just said, they experienced war, they've experienced persecution, poverty, and displacement. And this trauma has remained unprocessed due to the cultural stigma or the lack of access to mental health support. They experience what as we said, emotional suppression and a difficulty expressing affection with their children. So they might say things like, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about that time. Therapy is not for us. Therapy is for white people. And they have this misrepresentation and this thought that's not necessarily true, that to be strong is to be silent. If you are silent and you are stoic, then you are exuding an air of strength. So the problem here comes with these second generation children. Right? So the children of these immigrants are born and they don't understand the context within which their parents made the journey to whatever country they are in. They don't understand the trauma that their parents experienced during that time, which often creates tension between the parent and child, again, because children do not have context about what happened. And so these children experience confusion, guilt, and internalized pressure. That emotional suppression that the parents are exhibiting on themselves is making the children feel like an emotional burden. These children are being taught to be strong and grateful rather than seek help. So again, we don't talk about that. Don't go to therapy. So in this way, the parents are creating an expectation of their child in which they impose their own values of collectivism and strength. Again, what's good for the family and what do we learn from the culture, as opposed to letting the child experience their strength through their independence and choice. These parents also create a codependent relationship where they insinuate to their children that if they need help, they should be coming to them to ask for that help. They should not reach out to other members of the community. But some parents aren't open to being that helpful in the first place. Parents do this because they do not want to be seen as weak by other members of the community. And they don't want to bring shame to the family by showing to others that they need help. So the community that these immigrants are in is very tight-knit, and to have a child reach out for help outside of that community can often bring shame and fear of judgment. And again, these parents might experience fear of judgment from their community if they believe that their child has problems or if their children are seen as the problem kids. So that emotional disconnect between parent and child can lead to isolation and shame, increasing the risks of depression, anxiety, and internalized conflict. Okay, so now that we've discussed a little bit about the relationship between parent and child and how some of the traumatic experiences that these parents are going through sort of creates an emotional pressure on the children to be strong, silent, and independent. So we know that that's the dynamic that's going on at home. Let's talk a little bit about some of the dynamic that's going on outside of the home, because just like the parents who were struggling with acculturative stress, these children are also experiencing this sort of like cultural identity conflict. So these parents, because they have made the journey and have arrived at this new country, they are holding on tightly to the values that they are bringing from their country of origin. So another way to call the cultures, we have heritage culture, which is the culture from which the parents are, the culture of the ancestors, and the culture from where their background comes. And the dominant culture is the culture of the country that they are currently living in. It is the dominant culture because the reality is that most of the individuals that this child is going to be surrounding themselves with, whether it's at school or with friends in the neighborhood, is probably going to be individuals of the culture that is most dominant in that environment. So as we said, these first generation parents are very deeply rooted in the traditional cultural values, but these children are experiencing that dominant culture on an everyday basis, every time they step outside of the home and perhaps outside of the bubble of their neighborhood. These children are going to start experiencing conflict in a lot of different identity roles. So things, for example, like dating, gender roles, independence, and expression. So there are some cultures in which you can date as young as 12 years old, and there are other cultures where they say, no, you cannot date until you're 18, and you have to bring the person over, and I have to meet them, and I have to approve of them. So for some children who have that experience where they feel like they don't align with the dominant culture, that's where a lot of that conflict comes in, and it starts going back into the relationship with the parents. Another example is, like I said, is gender roles. There are some cultures in which gender roles are very clearly defined, and there are cultures in which it's much more flexible. And so these children might be wanting to go into a career or a hobby that goes against the gender role of their heritage culture, and that creates conflict between parent and child again. Language barriers can also hinder emotional communication, especially when children speak a dominant language better than their parents. This can create that hinder the emotional communication, because the children might feel more comfortable speaking to their parents in a language that they speak every day at school and with their friends, such as English, but the parents might not know English as well and want to speak to their children in Spanish. And thus that creates an environment in which the kids don't really want to, it's not that they don't want to, it's just that they don't feel as comfortable communicating to their parents, perhaps some of their struggles or a little bit of what they're going through. This creates for these children that life between two cultures, where they feel like they are one person at home and they feel like they're another person at school with their friends. And oftentimes they find themselves confused between who is the real me and when can I be this person and when can I be this other person. And ultimately they find themselves just thinking that they want to do what makes them happy, but they don't want to do that at the expense of their parents getting angry at them. These identity struggles can create that conflict at home because they feel like they have to live up to their parents' expectations and adhere to certain family dynamics. So these children may start suppressing aspects of themselves, such as their sexuality, their aspirations, and their values, simply because they don't want to disappoint their parents. Effectively, all this is doing is impacting their identity development and their mental health, because they're not allowing themselves to be true to themselves. And ultimately, this can create some internalized racism, where it doesn't matter if they're at home or if they are outside with their friends, whatever decision they make is going to be rejected in one way or another, which really allows the feelings of self-hatred to adhere themselves inside of them, and to make them feel unworthy and unhappy and feel like it doesn't matter what choice they make, it's going to be wrong, which really affects their self-esteem. Okay, so we talked a little bit about some of the things that are happening at home between the parents and the parents and the children. And I say parents, but it could be grandparents, it could be siblings, it could be any sort of family members. And I say children simply for the ease of not having to say second generation immigrant children. So to talk about family pressure and role conflict, we're going back inside the home for a little bit. And it's incredibly important to understand some of the roles that these parents are placing on their children, simply because that is the roles that were placed upon them when they were children or when they were growing up, or what they believe is the right thing based on the experiences that they went through during their traumatic experience, the journey that they went through, migrate to their country that they're currently residing in. So one of the first things that we talk about is parentification. Parentification is something that is very commonly heard of in several immigrant cultures. I know in my experience it's been the Hispanic culture, but I'm sure that we can say the same about other cultures in which the parents place a ginormous amount of responsibility on the children in the hopes of making their life a little bit easier and trying to teach their children responsibility. So it's a role reversal, which means that the parents are placing the responsibilities upon their children, which should not be. So an example that we have of this is when the parents, perhaps because of the language barrier, make the children call the doctor to make an appointment, or perhaps make the child be in the doctor's appointment with them to help translate the information between the doctor and the adult, which is incredibly inappropriate for a child to have to explain to a doctor some of the things that are going on in their parent's body. We also think about how often parents place the oldest sibling in charge of the youngest siblings simply because of convenience, because perhaps the parents have to go to work, and that's not convenience, that's a necessity, but it's putting a lot of responsibility on these children and placing a lot of pressure on them to do what is asked of them for the need of the family. So speaking about parental expectations, for many immigrants, I'm sure that we've heard about the parent sacrifice, the sacrifice that these immigrant parents have made when they made the decision to immigrate or migrate into their chosen country. And so in this situation, it's very common to hear the sacrifice. These immigrant parents will say something like, "We sacrificed everything for you. We did this for you to be successful and for you to move forward and grow." But ultimately, the way that this is being phrased in the context that it is being used is just putting a lot of pressure on these children and creating guilt. And again, reinforcing that silence, stoic strength. You know, we made the sacrifice for you, and we expect you to be quiet about it and to just work hard. So all this does is create an environment in which the children feel indebted for the sacrifices made for their future, which is a burden that they carry silently. This can also lead to these children experiencing success guilt, the inability to enjoy achievements due to family struggles. So it doesn't matter how successful these children are, whether they're getting straight A's or whether they're doing great in school, it's never going to feel enough for them, because they will go home and their parents will say, "Well, we sacrificed everything, so you can't possibly live up to this." So because these first generation parents are prioritizing survival and success over the emotional well-being due to those past sacrifices. So they might say things like, "We didn't come here for you to waste opportunities." So these children might be wanting to explore perhaps a hobby that they're interested in, or a career that is more of a passion for them. And these parents might really shut that down because they expect this child to really be able to push forward and be like ultimate success. And it creates, again, that achievement equals worth dynamic, where these children have to be successful and they have to be high achieving. And if they're not, then what did we do all of this for? So again, it's just placing this pressure on these children and affecting their mental health. They create a conditional love narrative where achievement equals worth. And so the emotional needs or these mental health concerns of these kids can be dismissed as first world problems, further silencing them. These parents are also creating opportunities of learned helplessness through that parentification, where they are kind of getting to a point where they say, "I can't possibly do this without you," to their child, in the hope that the child will stay with them and continue highly achieving, like working on proving their worth to these parents. And so the parents do this because they want to be able to protect their children, but ultimately it just comes out as a overprotectiveness or strictness. Okay, so we have We were at the house, now we were outside, we went back to the relationship. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the social challenges outside the home again for a second. There are, for these children that come from these immigrant parents, they can also experience many socioeconomic disparities simply because they live within the means that their parents have. And if these parents have been successful, that is amazing that they are able to get the resources that perhaps their parents didn't have when they first arrived at the country. But oftentimes, these parents might not be fully established yet and might still be trying to find ways to be completely successful. And so some of these second generation immigrants can feel isolated or excluded from their social groups and from certain educational opportunities because they don't have access to some of the opportunities that other kids who are from the dominant culture perhaps do have access to. So that can lead to discrimination and racism because they're being discriminated against based on their ethnicity or their immigrant background, which ultimately impacts their sense of belonging and their mental well-being. This can also lead to bullying, where on the playground or at school, a lot of the kids will purposely exclude them simply because they don't align with the standards that they have, the dominant culture children. Immigrant origin students may encounter specific challenges in the education system, again, including the language barriers, other cultural differences, and a lack of understanding about their unique needs. So as we said before, there are certain cultures that have a stigma around mental health. For example, like I said, the immigrants who say, you know, we have to be silent, we have to be stoic, we don't ask for others for help. And ultimately, that emotional disconnect is what leads these children to develop diagnoses such as anxiety, depression, self-esteem issues, trauma, and if it gets bad enough, get to a point where they experience suicidal ideation. That anxiety can look like an imposter syndrome, again, because it doesn't matter how successful these children are, they're not going to be worth enough to make up for the sacrifice that their parents made. That depression can look, again, like, I don't know who I am, I struggle, it doesn't matter what choices I make, it's always never going to be good enough for my parents or for the kids I'm trying to impress. And so anytime that they try to express, like have an opinion and express themselves, it's going to be shut down because they're not going to fit into the mold of both cultures. Again, the self-esteem issues tie into this, and it could be traumatic for them to have to live through this and to feel like they don't have a connection with their parents because the parents have certain expectations that it doesn't matter what they do, they feel like they're never going to meet them. And again, if this gets bad enough where it goes undiagnosed, unsupported, where they don't get any help, it can lead to suicidal ideation. So now that we know about both generations and generational trauma, I'm just going to put it in a really quick flow, right? So these parents are experiencing trauma in their country of origin, so they make the decision to migrate. They go through a traumatic experience. They make the decision to not process their trauma because they are in survival mode, and oftentimes that's not even a decision, it's just what they have to do to survive. But ultimately, that leads to them having unrealistic pressure on their children, which creates that emotional distance between them and their children. So the children, what they experience without the context is just an emotional distance that makes them feel like emotional burdens and leads to that cultural dissonance, and it leads to them having these unmet needs that develops into mental health diagnoses. So how can we provide support for this community? I think it's important first to recognize that this, like I said, it's not a choice. These patterns that we're recognizing show us that the blame doesn't fall exactly onto these first-gen parents, but we're talking about the systemic trauma that they have experienced in making the decision to migrate, and we emphasize that there is a need for intergenerational healing. When we talk about intergenerational healing, we're talking about healing from the top down. If we're looking to help these children, not only do we help the children, we're also looking to help the parents process their trauma and allow themselves to create emotional connections with their children. So first, we can start doing this by focusing on more accurate research. As we know, in many ways, the research that is currently out in scientific fields tends to focus on a white male perspective and how these experiences are perhaps only affecting the males, or perhaps are only affecting how does immigration affect the current citizens and what they have to experience. And so it's important for us to expand the research that we have done into how is this affecting the children, how is this affecting the women, and building inclusive and culturally grounded evidence. It's also important that we shift the narrative from a deficit-centered into a strength-based approach. So most existing research and interventions are grounded in a deficit-centered narrative, which essentially means that we're not looking at immigrant strengths, we're looking at their weaknesses, at the things that they are struggling with. But we have to understand that most often when we're looking at a bicultural aspect, we can get the best of both worlds and create an environment in which these children thrive. We also want to make sure that we do a lot of trauma-focused work. So this can be especially helpful when it comes to dealing with intergenerational trauma, because you're looking at specific modalities like IFS, internal family systems, EMDR, and trauma-informed care, where essentially we're working on breaking cycles. You're going deep inside yourself and finding values that come from within and not necessarily looking to external factors like our ancestors to help us define what we find valuable for ourselves. Lastly, we have intergenerational dialogue. So these are family-based interventions that help us, again, create that connection between the parent and child. So doing things like family therapy and individual therapy for the children and for the parents, where we honor the trauma that these parents went through while still acknowledging the emotional needs of the children. Again, breaking cycles is not easy, but it's definitely doable through these interventions, and understanding how important it is for us to acknowledge the connection between the unprocessed trauma of the parents and the unmet emotional needs of these children. So I'm going to be leaving on the screen these recommended readings. These are 4 books that I recommend for people who want to have more information about intergenerational trauma, as I go ahead and answer some questions and take a moment to, again, say thank you for allowing me opportunity to be here and to present on this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was really fascinating and so much to think about in what you shared. And I'm sure that our audience has a lot of questions. So if you want to go ahead and put your questions in the chat, that's going to be the best way for us to answer them. I think one of the questions I have, as we're, I think, let me just make sure we don't have any yet, is what you described is that we, within our community here in Miami-Dade County, because we have such a high population of people who are first and second generation families that have migrated, we have a lot of trauma, and then we have a lot of the sort of residual. I guess the question I want to ask, and this is coming from a NAMI point of view, is where are these people going to get their information if they're seeking help? Is it, I mean, the patients that you see, are they being referred to you through schools, through community organizations? Because we know that there's a barrier often,
Yes.
especially so could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I do receive referrals from schools, from teachers, from community centers, even from churches. So I think it's great that I think that the population is increasing of people who are seeking help, but it doesn't change that sort of stigma that parents have against mental health and against being seen as sort of the problem family. Again, they think that stoicism and silence is really what signifies strength. But I think I will say that perhaps some of us are not huge fans of social media, but I do think that the one good thing that social media has going for it is that it absolutely allows more information to spread quickly. And so
Mhm.
recently we've had an increase in social media posts of informational posts of what it means to struggle with a mental health disorder, which I think when children, not necessarily children, teenagers, see these posts, they are finding ways to communicate with their parents a little bit more effectively by showing their parents, hey, like this is something that I think I might have. It's not a big deal. Don't get scared. Everything's going to be fine. And they can do their own research on certain community organizations or mental health offices that they can go to and seek help. And like NAMI, right? You have a website that provides a lot of resources and a lot of information that helps these parents feel more informed and not be so standoffish to the idea of getting help for mental health, especially because now these adults, the parents, are starting to recognize, oh, maybe I'm having a problem with like my mental health. So I think that the increase in information available to people, both to the parents and to the children, is creating a connection for them to feel like they can talk to each other about it and also feel like, you know, if we can't talk to each other about it, can we go somewhere where they can educate us and help us talk to each other about it?
Okay, so I do want to put in, just let everyone know that we also have our helpline at NAMI. It's posted in the chat, and we answer that in English. We can take questions English, Spanish, Portuguese, Haitian Creole, French, also I think Urdu, right? And another Asian language. So anyone that has questions about any of this can call NAMI and we can speak to you. But the question we have is, if say you're the young adult child of in a immigrant family, and you need support of your parents to get uh, to attend therapy, what are some strategies? What can you say to them to them come in agreement with that? Do you have some advice on that?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to acknowledge that I know it can be incredibly scary and nerve-wracking to have to go to your parents and talk to them about something that maybe you've never talked to them about it before, or you're not sure the kind of reaction that they're going to have. So we can always start with honesty and making sure that we have sort of like a gentle startup where we're not going to talk about using sort of keywords or phrases that might be triggering for these parents, like saying things like crazy or I need help. So I think it's important to come from a place of the struggles that these individuals are experiencing and being able to say something like, I'm not I'm not sure how to say this, but I think I want to go talk to someone, talk to a friend, and I met someone or someone recommended this place and it really helped them. And so I'm wondering if we can make an effort to go, if you can take me or if I can go. And ultimately, let's just try one session. Let's just try one conversation with this person. And I really want to see how that makes me feel. I also think that for those that have the opportunity to do so, to be able to get help within their school environment, that can be a way where they don't necessarily have to um, be very explain too much to their parents where they're just looking for
Mhm.
information. School counselors can definitely just like be able to provide some basic information to these individuals without necessarily having um, to tell the parents everything about what's going on. And so it could be hard, but ultimately, I think these parents understand that we're here, that if they see their child is struggling, they have to give way a little bit and figure out how they can help.
Mhm. Well, and Michelle pointed out, and I think it's a very good point, when you have that conversation, you want to make sure that you're not blaming the
Oh,
parents for
absolutely.
the problem that you're having, because yeah, that you will probably get the opposite reaction than what you're trying to achieve. Um,
Yes, it's not, oh, because you're like this, I'm like this. No, again, it's a gentle startup. It's just, I'm sort of like struggling with this, and I'm wondering if we can find ways for me to get help with this.
Right. And so another question that has come up is, what would you recommend would be a good way to help a family member that probably suffers through the uh, parentiation that comes from being a second gen immigrant? So you talked about that, especially if the child speaks the language and they end up having to be the interpreter.
So, are you asking how to help the parent or the child?
The child.
The child who feels parentified, like who feels like they are made
Yes,
to be
right.
the parent.
Hmm.
Um, that's that's a tough one, right? But again, I think that honesty and communication would go a long way here if the parent is open to it, where one of the ways that these individuals can be made to feel strengthened is by placing certain boundaries and doing it in a way that perhaps the parent agrees with that value, right? So, for example, if this child says, or this young adult child says something along the lines of like, hey, it's really important for me to go to volleyball practice or baseball practice from this time to this time. I can't watch my siblings during this time. Or setting again a little bit of a boundary with a parent where they're like, oh, I can't really help you with this at this moment, but I can absolutely, again, reaching a compromise, help in at another point in time or in another way, in which as a family member, you're still expected to sort of help, but trying to change the way that that help looks so that it feels a little bit more age appropriate and there's not as much pressure on them to be the parent. So, like I said, if that example looks like them looking after their siblings, those are a little bit of stricter boundaries. Like, I don't feel comfortable with this because something happened, or I have this other thing to do. Or it might look like, taking on an after school job. I have to help the family financially. And so that might look like I don't want to give you all of my paycheck, but I'll give you some of it, or my hours are really limited, so I can't help as much as I want to. But
Well,
communication, setting little boundaries.
mhm. I loved what you said about finding that shared value.
Yes.
So if you say, well, I'll give you some of my paycheck, but remember, we want me to learn to become independent. So I need to, so it's that shared value. I think that's a great strategy. I think especially when you're talking about parents and children, it's very hard to get to that place, to even sometimes, there's a lot of anger. So to get back to a place of compassion and shared values, I think is something that is hard for people, and it takes some coaching. But I think that's really a great strategy. And then we have, I think, yeah, we have a question here about how can we help immigrants who have gone through traumatic journeys, traumatic transitions, people who have experienced violence, potentially sexual violence or other kinds of abuse or violence? What kind of help is best for them?
I think based on sort of the conversation, like the topic that I was talking about, oftentimes for these individuals, it can feel better, or we can sort of try to hide it, try to not talk about it, pretend that it didn't happen. And so as friends, family members, or professionals that have a relationship with these individuals, I think one of the ways that we can help them is to share stories of other individuals that have gone through similar experiences and how they have gotten help, to try to like instill a sense of hope in them and let them know that they don't have to go through this alone, that this is something that many other people have also struggled with, and that it doesn't have to be something that completely takes over and kind of keeps them in a hole of hopelessness or of depression. That we can help them by sharing that, like sharing the stories of others and offering suggestions as long as they're open to it. And if not, trying to be there and offer support in whatever way we can, whether that looks like, hey, do you want to go for a walk, or do you want to chat on the phone with me? about this experience or about something else unrelated? Like, do you need support or do you need a distraction? Like, how can I offer that help for you in the moment? And being there for them. I think that's incredibly helpful as well.
We know at NAMI that the sharing of stories really gives people the comfort and ability to then share their own story. So again,
Yeah.
I think that helping people to find a forum where they're comfortable to share their story, whether it might be just a group of recent immigrants who doing something else, but if they're together, these stories can come up in a safe atmosphere. We're going to take this one more question because I'm very curious about this, and I know we may go over just a minute or two, but in listening to this, my family, like every family pretty much in the US immigrated from another country, but it was several generations ago. And so both my parents' families came from Ireland. And there are still cultural things that were ingrained in me growing up that this is what Irish people do, and this is how. So someone asked, has there been any studies that document the first, second, and third generation and so on of traumas caused by immigrants migrating to the United States?
You know what? That is a great question, and I genuinely don't know. I can't say that I have read studies that have gone that far back. Usually the research is focused on first and second generation. So it definitely would be interesting to look into that and see if there is a any further evidence of um how these individuals are affected, because I do think that inevitably it's yes, you are always going to have ancestors going back like fourth and fifth generation values and traditions that trickle down and affect how you do things, you know, the foods that you eat, the language that you speak, how you celebrate certain holidays, etc. But we have in this context, right, I've been focusing a lot on the trauma of migration. And so
Mm.
there are, I've been talking about how trauma affects parenting and behaviors, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the negative experiences that affect parenting and behaviors. There's also positive experiences and positive values that trickle down from even further back that there's probably research on and we have to look into it.
Well, I think that's a good point too. We always like to end with the message of hope and the idea too that there are positives to this. Yes, it may be difficult, and as a young adult, there's a lot of stress, but looking at that positive, I am a person who has better opportunity here than I had before my family made this choice. And so thinking about those positives and actually reinforcing them
Yes.
too. Well, okay, we are out of time, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. And Stephanie, thank you, and Baksani Care for sharing you with us. Um, we've had a great evening tonight. We had a great attendance, and we are going to be sending out to everyone who attended. This is something new we're starting, hopefully by the end of the week. An evaluation form so you can give some feedback on what you'd like to see coming up and any other questions you have, and we'll be back in touch with everyone. So thanks everyone for coming. Stephanie, thank you so much, and everyone
Thank
have a
you.
good
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.